A wave of sadness swept across the Mount Holyoke campus as students and alumni are mourning the loss of their beloved unofficial mascot, Jorge the Goose. After speaking with the student, Western Mass News correspondent or reporter Taylor Smith is live in the studio for us. And Taylor, what did you learn about Jorge?
Well, Amanda, I was told Jorge the Goose was truly a staple of the Mount Holyoke community. Now, he died after flying into a window. Shockingly, all of those who witnessed it. Now, students and alumni and faculty described the news as truly devastating, with many struggling to grasp the loss of the goose that brought so much joy to campus life. Now, one student telling Western Mass News Jorge was more than just a goose. He was a prominent symbol of the Mount Holyoke tradition that will truly be missed.
It's like something absolutely unimaginable that you'd never think of, like your 4 years here at Mount Holyoke, that Jorge, like such an icon, would pass away in such a tragic way.
And that's right. In a response to his passing, students have created a memorial to honor him, as you saw in those pictures a moment ago. And the school has also released a statement to students offering counseling for those who are struggling with the devastating end of their beloved goose's life. Reporting live in the studio, Taylor Smith, Western Mass News.